Walter Hayes had eaten lunch at the Redwood Trail Diner every Thursday for almost 8 years. Same booth by the window. Same order. Soup, toast, tea with lemon. The waitresses knew him by name. The regulars nodded when he walked in. Nothing about that afternoon was supposed to be different. But that day, Walter could not keep his hand still. The spoon in his cup rattled against the glass. He wrapped both hands around the mug to hide the shaking. It didn't help much. Lena noticed the moment she set the tea down. "You all right today, Mr. Hayes?" she asked quietly. Walter forced a small smile. "Just getting old," he said. But the smile didn't stay. He kept looking toward the door, then toward the clock on the wall, then back at the door again. Lena followed his eyes, but didn't ask more. She had seen that look before on people who were waiting for something they didn't want to happen. The door opened with its tired bell, but it wasn't who Walter was waiting for. 5 motorcycles had just pulled up outside. Everyone inside the diner heard them, engines rolling low and heavy. Conversations softened. A few people glanced through the window and quickly looked away again. The door opened wider. The bikers stepped in, leather vests, boots still dusted from the road. They weren't loud. They didn't need to be. People made space automatically. They took their usual corner booth like they always did. Lena grabbed menus, even though she knew they wouldn't need them. "Coffee," one of them said. "Burgers." Another added, "No onions." Same order as always. At the center of the table sat the tallest of them. Broad shoulders, iron gray hair, tied short at the back. His name was Cole. Most people in the diner didn't know his real name, but they knew enough to leave him alone. Cole took a slow sip of coffee and scanned the room without turning his head. His eyes moved the way a man's do when he spent most of his life noticing things others miss. He noticed Walter almost immediately, not because the old man looked at him, but because he kept trying not to. Walter stared down at his tea, then at the envelope resting beside his plate, then at the clock again. His breathing was shallow now. Lena returned to the counter, but kept watching him. She had served Walter long enough to know when something was wrong. 5 minutes passed. Walter did not touch his soup. The envelope stayed where it was. Finally, he picked it up. His fingers tightened around the edge like it might slip away. He looked across the diner again, toward the bikers. He hesitated. Anyone else might have stayed seated. Anyone else might have waited for whoever they were afraid of. Walter Hayes pushed himself slowly out of the booth. His knees complained as he straightened up. A few heads turned as he began walking across the diner floor. Not toward the door. Not toward the restroom. Straight toward the biker's table. One of the younger riders noticed him first. He nudged the man beside him. Conversation faded slightly as Walter stopped at the edge of the booth. Cole looked up. The old man was smaller than he expected. Thin shoulders. Old army cap pulled low. But the posture was unmistakable. Military, even after all these years. Walter cleared his throat. His voice was steady but quiet. "Sir," he said. Cole didn't answer yet. He just watched him. Walter tightened his grip on the envelope. "I know this is strange," he continued, "and I know I probably shouldn't be asking." One of the bikers smirked slightly. Another leaned back to watch. Walter swallowed. "But I don't have anyone else here today." Cole set his coffee cup down slowly. "What do you need?" Walter glanced toward the diner door again, then back at Cole. "My nephew is coming," he said. "About 15 minutes. Cole waited. Walter continued. "He's bringing papers." The word papers hung in the air for a second. No one at the table spoke. "He told me they were from medical insurance," Walter said. "Just some routine forms." He shook his head slightly. "But I found out this morning that they're not." One of the bikers frowned. Walter lifted the envelope slightly. "Power of attorney," he said quietly. "Once I sign them, everything becomes his decision." Lena had stepped closer without realizing it. She stopped just behind the counter, listening. Cole's expression didn't change. "So don't sign them," he said. Walter gave a tired little laugh. "You'd think it was that simple." He glanced at the door again. "My nephew doesn't take no for an answer very well." The diner had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the cook in the back had slowed down. Walter took a breath that sounded heavier than it should have been. "I serve in the infantry for 32 years, he said. "I've been shot at. I've slept in trenches in the winter. I've buried friends." His eyes met Cole's for the first time. "But I'll tell you something honest. I've never been as scared as I am right now." Cole studied him. The old man wasn't exaggerating. Fear had a way of showing itself in small places. The tightness around the eyes, the way someone held their shoulders. Walter had the look of a man standing alone at the edge of something he couldn't stop. He shifted his weight slightly. "I just need someone sitting with me," Walter said. "Someone who looks like they belong there." Cole said nothing. Walter hesitated one more moment. Then he asked the question, "Would you pretend to be my son today?" The words settled over the table. One of the bikers let out a short laugh before catching himself. Another raised his eyebrows. Cole didn't react right away. He simply watched Walter's face. There was no joke in it. No trick. Just a tired old man asking a stranger for help because he had nowhere else to go. Lena stepped closer and leaned slightly toward Cole. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's telling the truth," she said quietly. Cole glanced at her. "Last week," Lena continued softly, "his nephew was here, talking to his wife." She swallowed. "They said once the papers were signed, they'd move him into a care facility and sell the house." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. He looked back at Walter. The old man stood there waiting, shoulders squared like a soldier waiting for orders. Not begging, just hoping. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Finally, Cole slid out of the booth. The leather seat creaked under his weight. He moved aside and gestured toward the empty space next to him. "Sit down," he said calmly. Walter blinked once. "Sir," Cole nodded toward the seat again. "Sit down, Dad." The word landed softly, but everyone in the diner heard it. Walter lowered himself into the booth like his legs had suddenly lost strength. Cole draped an arm across the back of the seat behind him. Not dramatic, just natural enough to look real. The other bikers exchanged glances. Then one of them leaned forward. "So," he said casually to Walter, "how's the garden doing this year?" Another added, "Still hate tomatoes like you used to?" Walter stared at them, confused for a second. Then he understood what they were doing. His shoulders relaxed slightly. For the first time since he walked in, he let out a small breath. The performance had begun. Cole lifted his coffee again. His voice carried just enough for the room to hear. "We were waiting for you," he said. "Family lunch." The tension in Walter's chest loosened just a little. Lena wiped her hands on a towel and returned to the counter, pretending nothing unusual was happening. Outside, another car pulled slowly into the diner parking lot. Walter saw it through the window first. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "That's him," he whispered. Cole didn't turn around. He just took another sip of coffee. The diner door opened. The bell rang, and Evan Brooks stepped inside. Evan Brooks stopped just inside the doorway of the Redwood Trail Diner, the bell still swinging above his head as if it hadn't quite decided whether to ring again. He had expected to see his uncle sitting alone in the usual booth by the window, hunched over tea, waiting politely the way Walter Hayes always waited. Instead, he saw something that made him slow down immediately. The booth was full. Not just full. Occupied by 5 men in leather vests who looked like they had ridden straight out of a thunderstorm and into the diner. And at the center of them sat Walter. Evan's smile appeared automatically, the way a man smile does when he thinks he still controls the situation. But it faded halfway across the room as he noticed the large gray-haired biker sitting beside Walter with his arm resting across the back of the booth like he had been there for years. Marion stepped in behind Evan, brushing dust from her coat and glancing around the diner with thinly hidden irritation. She noticed the bikers, too, and her expression tightened. "That's him," she whispered. Evan nodded once without looking back at her. He straightened his tie, adjusted the slim leather briefcase in his hand, and walked toward the booth. Cole saw him coming long before Evan reached the table. He didn't move, didn't shift. He simply took another slow drink of coffee and waited. Walter felt the tension building before a single word was spoken. His fingers rested flat on the table, as if he were holding them there deliberately so they wouldn't shake again. Evan stopped beside the booth and forced the rest of his smile back into place. "Uncle Walt," he said brightly. "There you are." Walter looked up slowly. "Hello, Evan." Evan glanced at the men around the table, then back at Walter. "I thought we agreed to meet alone," he said. Cole spoke before Walter could answer. His voice was calm and steady. "We're having lunch." Evan turned toward him. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. And you are? He asked. Cole held his gaze. Family. The word landed heavier than it sounded. Evan gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. That's funny, he said. Because as far as I know, my uncle doesn't have family here. Cole leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. You know wrong. One of the other bikers shifted in the booth beside him, not aggressively, just enough to remind Evan how many of them there were. Marion stepped closer to Evan's shoulder. Her voice carried the practiced patience of someone used to getting what she wanted eventually. Walter, she said, we drove almost 40 minutes to get here. I'm sure you remember the paperwork we discussed. Walter did not answer immediately. He looked down at the table, then back up at Evan again. Yes, he said quietly. I remember. Evan lifted the briefcase and set it carefully on the edge of the table. The metal clasp clicked open with a neat, precise sound. He slid out a thick folder of documents and placed them in front of Walter. Just a few signatures, he said. Same forms we talked about. This will make everything much easier moving forward. Cole glanced down at the stack of papers without touching them. Easier for who? Evan's smile returned again, thinner this time. For my uncle, of course. Cole looked back at him. That's so. Marion stepped in before Evan could respond again. Walter, the doctors agree that this arrangement is the safest option for you, she said. You'll still have access to your finances, but decisions will be easier for everyone involved. Walter noticed something then. She didn't say easier for you. She said easier for everyone. Cole noticed it too. He leaned back slightly and folded his arms. Evan slid the top page across the table toward Walter. We can take care of this quickly, he said. Then you can enjoy the rest of your lunch. The diner was silent enough now that the scrape of the paper against the table sounded unusually loud. Walter looked down at the page. The lines of legal text seemed thicker than he remembered. The signature line waited at the bottom like a small trap. Evan took a pen from his jacket and placed it beside the paper. Right here, he said. Walter didn't touch the pen. Instead, he looked toward Cole. Just once. A small glance that most people in the room might not have noticed. Cole noticed. Evan noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. Uncle Walt, he said carefully. Who exactly are these gentlemen? Cole answered before Walter could speak again. I'm his son. The booth went still. Evan blinked once as if the words had arrived in the wrong order. That's not possible, he said flatly. Cole shrugged slightly. Funny thing about family. Sometimes people miss the introductions. One of the bikers at the end of the booth chuckled quietly. Marianne folded her arms. Walter, she said sharply, this is ridiculous. Walter's voice remained calm. I'm not signing anything today. Evan stared at him. For a moment, the polite tone slipped. You told me yesterday you would. Walter nodded. I know. Evan tapped the pen against the table. Then what changed? Walter didn't answer immediately. He looked at the papers again. Then at Evan. I read them, he said simply. Marianne's jaw tightened. They're standard legal protections, she said. Cole finally reached forward and placed one large hand on the stack of documents. Not taking them yet, just resting his palm there. Mind if I take a look? Evan hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the other bikers again, then back to Cole. Slowly, he pushed the papers toward him. Go ahead, he said. Cole lifted the top page. He didn't read every word. He didn't need to. Certain phrases were easy to spot even at a glance. Durable power of attorney, financial authority, medical authority. Cole placed the page back down. You planning to run his life for him? Evan's voice grew colder. I'm planning to help him. Looks like control, Cole said. Marianne leaned forward. Walter can't manage certain responsibilities anymore, she said. This arrangement protects him. Walter's voice came quietly but clearly. From what? Marianne looked at him. From making mistakes. Walter nodded slowly. I see. The diner remained silent. Even the cook had stopped moving in the kitchen doorway. Evan pushed the pen closer to Walter again. Let's not drag this out, he said. Sign the papers. Walter didn't move. Cole picked up the stack again. He flipped through the pages this time, slower. Then he looked back at Evan. You said doctors recommended this? Evan nodded. That's right. Cole tilted his head slightly. Funny thing about doctors, he said. They usually like to talk to the patient first. Marianne's eyes hardened. Walter has already been evaluated. Cole held her gaze. Has he? No one answered immediately. Walter felt something strange happening in his chest then. For months, every conversation about these papers had ended the same way, with Evan speaking louder and Walter feeling smaller. But this time someone else was asking the questions. Someone who didn't seem impressed by the briefcase or the paperwork or the polite smiles. Evan's voice sharpened. We're wasting time. He looked directly at Walter. Sign the papers. Walter looked back at him. No. The word hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Evan stared at him in disbelief. Marianne's patience snapped first. She reached forward and pulled the folder back toward herself, flipping quickly to another page. Walter, listen carefully, she said. Without this arrangement, certain things will become very difficult for you. Cole leaned slightly closer. Sounds like a threat. Marianne ignored him. Your house needs repairs. Your medical bills are increasing. Managing those things alone isn't realistic anymore. Walter met her eyes. I've managed so far. Evan slammed the pen down on the table. You're being stubborn. Cole slowly gathered the papers into one hand. He looked at them again, then at Evan, then back at the pages. For a moment, no one spoke. And then Cole did something none of them expected. He tore the entire stack of papers straight down the middle. The ripping sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Evan's mouth opened in shock. Marian gasped. Cole tore the pages again and again. Thin strips of legal text fluttered down across the table like pale confetti. When he finished, he dropped the shredded papers in front of Evan and leaned back in the booth. That conversation's over, he said calmly. Evan stared at the ruined documents, his face drained of color. Marian looked ready to explode. But before either of them could speak again, Walter did something no one expected either. The old man leaned forward, covered his face with both hands, and began to cry. Walter's shoulders shook quietly for several seconds. No one in the diner spoke. Not Cole, not the bikers, not Evan. The only sound was Walter trying to steady his breathing. It wasn't loud crying. It was the kind that came from deep inside, a person who had been holding fear in his chest for too long. Cole didn't rush him. He simply rested one large hand on Walter's back and let the moment pass the way it needed to. Across the table, Evan looked stunned, then angry, then something closer to uncertain. This was not how the afternoon had been supposed to go. The plan had been simple. Walk in, smile, lay out the paperwork, guide the old man through a few signatures, walk out with control of everything. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a diner with shredded legal documents scattered across the table and 5 bikers staring at him like they had been waiting for trouble all day. Marianne recovered first. She leaned forward sharply and pointed at the torn pages. You had no right to do that, she snapped. Cole looked up at her slowly. Sure I did. His tone stayed calm, which only made her angrier. Those were legal documents, she said. You just destroyed them. Cole shrugged slightly. Then you can print new ones. Evan stepped closer to the table. You think this is funny? Cole met his eyes. Not really. Evan's voice dropped lower. You just interfered in a private family matter. Cole leaned back a little in the booth, completely relaxed. Didn't look private when you were trying to pressure him in a crowded diner. Evan glanced around the room then. For the first time, he noticed that almost everyone had stopped pretending not to watch. A truck driver at the counter had turned halfway on his stool. 2 elderly women in the corner booth were staring openly now. Lena stood behind the counter gripping a dish towel, like she might tear it in half. Evan's confidence began to thin out under all those eyes. He looked back at Walter. The old man had lowered his hands now, but his face was still wet with tears. Cole handed him a napkin without saying anything. Walter wiped his eyes slowly and took a long breath. I'm all right, he murmured. Cole nodded once. Take your time. Evan straightened his jacket again, trying to regain the calm authority he had walked in with. Uncle Walt, he said carefully, this situation is getting out of hand. Walter looked up at him. No, he said quietly. It was out of hand before. Marian folded her arms tightly. You're letting strangers manipulate you. Cole smiled faintly at that. Manipulate? Marianne ignored him and continued speaking to Walter. These men don't care about you. They're enjoying the spectacle. Walter shook his head slowly. No, he said again. They're the first people today who actually asked what I wanted. Evan exhaled sharply. You're making a mistake. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Maybe, he said, but it'll be my mistake. The words landed harder than the torn papers had. Evan looked at the shredded documents again. His jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might explode with anger. Instead, he closed the briefcase slowly and snapped the clasp shut. The sharp metallic click echoed across the table. Fine, he said. If you don't want help, don't ask for it later. Walter didn't answer. Evan turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Cole. This isn't over, he said. Cole didn't even bother to sit up. It is today. Evan stared at him for another second, then walked out of the diner. Marion followed close behind, heels striking the floor harder with each step. The bell above the door rang sharply as it closed behind them. For a few seconds after they left, the diner remained completely still. Then the truck driver at the counter began clapping slowly. The sound was quiet at first, almost hesitant. Another person joined, then another. Within moments, half the diner was applauding. Not cheering, just clapping in steady respect for the old man sitting at the booth. Walter looked around in surprise, embarrassed by the attention. He tried to wave it off. That's enough, he said softly. Really? But the clapping continued for a few seconds longer before fading away. Lena wiped at her eyes quickly and walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. Refill? She asked Cole. Cole nodded and slid his cup forward. Walter sat quietly while Lena topped off the mugs around the table. When she finished, she leaned down slightly toward Walter. You did the right thing, she said softly. Walter gave a small nod, but didn't say anything. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was fading now. He suddenly looked older again, shoulders slumping a little in the booth. Cole noticed immediately. You got somewhere to be after this? He asked. Walter shook his head. Just home. Someone waiting there? Cole asked. Walter gave a small smile that carried more loneliness than humor. Just the dog next door barking at my mailbox. Cole looked at him for a moment. Where do you live? Cedar Lane, Walter said. One of the bikers across the table raised an eyebrow. That the little white house by the bend? Walter nodded, surprised. That's the one. The biker shrugged. We ride past there sometimes. Cole finished his coffee and set the mug down. You driving yourself? Walter nodded again. My old sedan's outside. Cole thought about that for a moment. Then he slid out of the booth. The leather creaked as he stood up. The other bikers followed without needing to be asked. Walter looked up at them in confusion. What's going on? Cole picked up his helmet from the edge of the table. We're going to make sure you get home all right. Walter blinked. You don't have to do that. Cole slipped the helmet under his arm. Didn't say we had to. One of the other bikers tossed a few bills on the table to cover the food. Another clapped Walter lightly on the shoulder. Come on, he said with an easy grin. Field trip. Walter hesitated for only a moment before pushing himself slowly out of the booth. When they stepped outside the diner, the afternoon sun felt brighter than it had earlier. 5 motorcycles gleamed in the parking lot beside Walter's aging sedan. A couple of people standing near the gas pumps across the road stared openly at the strange convoy forming around the old man. Walter unlocked his car and opened the door, still unsure what to say. You really don't have to escort me, he said again. Cole leaned slightly toward the driver's window. Humor us. Walter sat behind the wheel and started the engine. The old car coughed once before settling into a low rumble. Behind him, the motorcycles roared to life one by one. The sound filled the parking lot like distant thunder. Walter checked his mirrors. 5 bikes lined up behind him. For the first time all day, he felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not fear, something closer to relief. He eased the sedan out of the parking lot and onto the road towards Cedar Lane. The motorcycles followed close behind, their engines rolling steady and low. Walter drove slowly, partly because his car couldn't go much faster, partly because he kept glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure they were still there. They were, the entire way. When he finally turned onto Cedar Lane, the houses grew smaller and farther apart. His white house sat near the curve, just as the biker had said. Walter pulled into the gravel driveway and shut off the engine. The motorcycles rolled in behind him one at a time. Engines cut off. Silence settled over the yard. Cole removed his helmet and stepped off the bike. Walter climbed slowly out of the sedan. For a moment, they simply stood there looking at the house. It wasn't in terrible condition, but it carried the quiet wear of a place that had been lived in alone for too long. Cole walked up the small wooden steps to the porch and tested the railing with one hand. It wobbled slightly. Another biker checked the back gate. A third glanced toward the loose gutter along the roofline. No one said much. They just noticed things. Walter watched them with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Finally, Cole reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small prepaid phone. He held out to Walter. "What's this?" Walter asked. "One button," Cole said. "Our number's in it." Walter stared at the phone. "For what?" Cole shrugged. "In case you need something." Walter hesitated. Pride flickered across his face for a moment. Then he slowly took the phone and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. Cole nodded once. "You're all right now." The other bikers began heading back toward their motorcycles. Engines started again. Cole put his helmet back on and swung onto the bike. Walter stood in the driveway watching them. Before pulling away, Cole looked at him one last time. "See you around, Dad," he said. The motorcycles rolled down Cedar Lane one by one and disappeared around a bend. Walter stood there long after the sound of the engines faded. Then he reached into his pocket and touched the phone again, just to make sure it was real. Walter stood in the driveway for a long time after the motorcycles disappeared around the bend in Cedar Lane. The afternoon felt strangely quiet again, almost like the whole thing at the diner had been a dream that faded too quickly. He finally turned, walked up the short wooden steps, and unlocked his front door. The house inside looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same worn couch, the same small television in the corner, the same stack of unopened mail on the kitchen table. But something about the silence inside felt different now. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out the small prepaid phone Cole had given him. It was simple. One button, one number programmed into it. He stared at it for a moment, then placed it carefully beside the sink and told himself he probably wouldn't need it. The next 2 days passed quietly. Walter went through his normal routine. Coffee in the morning, a slow walk around the block, a visit to the grocery store for soup and bread. The envelope with the legal papers stayed in the trash where he had thrown it after returning home. Evan didn't call. Marion didn't appear. For a brief moment, Walter allowed himself to believe the problem might actually be over. On the third night, the pipe under his kitchen sink burst. It started as a small drip while Walter was washing a cup. Then the drip turned into a thin spray, and before he could even reach down to tighten the valve, water began pouring across the cabinet floor. Walter crouched down slowly, trying to twist the metal fitting with his stiff fingers. It didn't move. Within seconds, water was spreading across the kitchen tiles. Walter sighed and sat back on his heels. 20 years ago, he would have fixed something like this in 5 minutes. Now his hands barely had the strength to grip the wrench. He looked toward the counter. The small prepaid phone was still sitting beside the sink, exactly where he had left it. Walter stared at it for nearly a full minute. He didn't like asking for help. Most men his age didn't. Pride could be stubborn even when the body wasn't. Finally, he stood up, dried his hands on a towel, and picked up the phone. One button. He pressed it. The line rang once, twice. Then someone answered. "Yeah." The voice was deep and familiar. Walter cleared his throat. "Hello, Cole?" There was a pause on the other end. Then Cole's voice came back, calm as always. "You all right, Dad?" Walter almost laughed at that. "I think my kitchen's trying to become a swimming pool." Cole didn't ask any more questions. "Address is still Cedar Lane?" "Yes." "Give us 40 minutes." The line clicked off. Walter looked at the phone again, slightly surprised at how quickly that had happened. 38 minutes later, the low sound of motorcycles rolled down Cedar Lane again. Walter opened the front door just as 2 bikes pulled into his driveway. Cole stepped off the first one, and another rider followed behind him carrying a small metal toolbox. "Kitchen?" Cole asked. Walter nodded and stepped aside. Within a few minutes, the 2 men were crouched beneath the sink-turning valves and tightening fittings while water dripped steadily into a bucket. Walter stood nearby, feeling slightly awkward, unsure whether he should hover or stay out of the way. After a few turns of a wrench, the leaking pipe finally stopped hissing. The second biker wiped his hands with a rag and nodded toward Cole. Good now. Cole stood up and turned the faucet briefly. No spray. No drip. Just normal water flow again. Walter let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, he said quietly. The biker shrugged. Simple fix. Cole looked around the kitchen for a moment. Simple things. The kind that had become harder for Walter to handle alone. Before leaving, Cole walked over to the kitchen counter and tapped the prepaid phone with one finger. Use it when you need it, he said. Walter nodded. I will. After that, the calls came easier. A fallen tree branch after a storm that Walter couldn't move by himself. Two bikers arrived with a chainsaw and cleared the driveway in 15 minutes. A week later, Walter's old sedan refused to start on a cold morning when he needed to get to the VA clinic for an appointment. One phone call brought 3 motorcycles and a pickup truck that drove him there anyway. Sometimes there wasn't even a problem. Sometimes one of the bikers would just stop by on the way back from a ride to check the mailbox or help carry groceries inside. At first, Walter felt guilty every time he pressed the button on that phone, but the men never made him feel like he was bothering them. They treated the calls the same way soldiers treated a radio signal in the field, something you answered because someone needed help. Weeks turned into months. Walter began bringing large containers of chili to the clubhouse the bikers used outside of town. The building looked rough from the outside, but inside it felt warmer than most places Walter had been in years. The men sat around long wooden tables drinking coffee and listening while Walter told stories from his days in the infantry. Stories about winter training exercises. Stories about letters from home during deployment. Stories about friends whose names he hadn't spoken out loud in decades. The bikers listened quietly. They didn't interrupt much, but they understood the weight behind those stories in a way most people didn't. Cole often arrived late after long rides and would sit down beside Walter on the porch outside the clubhouse. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat there watching the road grow dark in the evening. Neither one felt the need to fill every silence. Meanwhile, Evan Brooks' plan had not gone as smoothly as he expected. The shredded paperwork at the diner had drawn more attention than he realized. Questions began circulating. A doctor who had been listed on the documents suddenly withdrew his evaluation. A legal review followed shortly after. Within a few months, Evan quietly sold his house and moved away from the area entirely. Walter heard about it from Lena at the diner one afternoon. She brought his usual tea and leaned closer to the booth. Looks like your nephew won't be bothering you anymore, she said. Walter nodded slowly. I hope he finds whatever it was he was looking for, he replied. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Thursdays at the diner continued the way they always had. But now sometimes a motorcycle would be parked outside when Walter arrived. Sometimes, too, Lena would shake her head and laugh every time she saw the group crowding into the booth. The other customers had grown used to it as well. The bikers still made the room quiet when they entered, but now the quiet carried curiosity instead of fear. Walter Hayes was no longer the old man eating alone by the window. He had company, and every now and then, when Walter stepped outside the diner after lunch, he would hear the familiar rumble of engines nearby and realize something he had not felt in a very long time. He was not alone anymore. The years moved quietly after that, not in dramatic ways, not in the kind of moments people usually tell stories about, but in small, steady changes that slowly filled the spaces Walter Hayes had once thought would stay empty forever. Cedar Lane stayed the same narrow road it had always been. The white house by the bend stayed a little worn around the edges. The porch railings still creaked slightly when someone leaned against it, but the house was rarely silent anymore. Sometimes it was Danny stopping by with a bag of groceries Walter didn't remember asking for. Sometimes it was two bikes pulling into the driveway after a long ride, their engines cooling in the evening air while the riders sat on the porch with Walter and passed around cups of coffee. The visits were never formal. Nobody knocked the way strangers knock. They just stepped onto the porch and pushed the screen door open like they had been doing it their entire lives. Walter pretended to complain about it every time. One of these days I'm going to start charging rent, he would say, but the smile on his face always gave him away. The prepaid phone stayed in the same shirt pocket every day. Walter didn't press the button as often as he could have. Sometimes he picked it up just to look at it before putting it back again. But the number on that phone had quietly changed the way he moved through the world. It meant he no longer measured every problem by whether he could handle it alone. The men from the clubhouse became a normal part of the week. Thursday lunches at Redwood Trail Diner grew louder than they had been in years. Lena would roll her eyes every time the booth filled with leather vests and coffee cups, but she never complained when Walter showed up with them. The other customers had stopped staring long ago. In fact, some of them began greeting the riders the same way they greeted Walter. A nod, a quiet hello. Sometimes the truck driver from the counter even joined their table when the place wasn't too busy. Word about what happened at the diner had traveled farther than anyone expected. The story changed a little each time it was retold. Some versions said there were 10 bikers instead of 5. Some said Evan Brooks had stormed out shouting threats. Others said Cole had barely spoken a word before tearing the papers in half. Walter never bothered correcting any of it. The truth had already done its work. By the time the first winter rolled around after that afternoon, Walter had settled into a new routine. On colder evenings, he would sit on the porch wrapped in a thick blanket while Cole parked his motorcycle at the edge of the driveway and climbed the steps beside him. Neither man talked much at first. They watched the quiet street together while the last light faded behind the trees. Sometimes Cole asked about Walter's time in the infantry. Sometimes Walter asked about long rides through places he had never seen. But most of the time, they just sat there sharing the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It was during one of those evenings that Walter finally said something he had been thinking about for months. You know, he said, staring down the road, that afternoon at the diner, I almost didn't walk over to your table. Cole didn't look surprised. Most people wouldn't have. Walter nodded slowly. I stood up 3 times before I actually did it. Cole leaned back slightly in the chair. What changed your mind? Walter gave a quiet chuckle. Fear, he said. Sometimes fear pushes you forward instead of holding you back. Cole thought about that for a moment, but didn't answer. The porch light buzzed softly above them. Inside the house, the old kitchen clock ticked in its steady rhythm. Life continued that way for several years. The bikes came and went. Chilly nights at the clubhouse became something of a tradition. Walter's stories about winter deployments and muddy training fields slowly grew shorter as he repeated them over time, but the riders never seemed to mind hearing them again. They listened the same way each time, like those memories deserve patience. Age, however, does what age always does. Walter moved slower with each passing year. His walks around the block grew shorter. The grocery trips became less frequent. The men from the clubhouse started dropping off supplies more often without even asking if he needed them. Walter protested every time, but nobody listened. One winter morning, a bad case of pneumonia finally sent him to the hospital. The doctors admitted him immediately. The nurses were slightly uneasy when the first biker appeared in the waiting room that evening. They grew even more uneasy when a second rider arrived an hour later. By midnight, 3 of them were sitting quietly in the chairs beside Walter's room. None of them caused trouble. None of them spoke loudly. They simply took turns sitting beside the hospital bed while the old man slept. After a few days, the nurses stopped questioning it. In fact, one of them brought extra coffee during the night shift because she noticed the riders rarely left the hallway. Cole spent the longest hours there. He usually arrived after dark, helmet tucked under one arm, and took the chair beside Walter's bed while the machines hummed quietly in the background. Sometimes Walter woke up and found him there. You should be out riding somewhere, Walter murmured once. Cole shook his head slightly. Road will still be there tomorrow. Walter smiled faintly and closed his eyes again. When spring finally pushed the winter cold away, Walter returned home to Cedar Lane. He was thinner now. His breathing was slower, but the porch still felt like the right place to sit in the evenings. One autumn afternoon, nearly 5 years after the day at the diner, the driveway filled with motorcycles again. The riders gathered for one of their usual dinners at the house. Someone brought groceries. Someone else set up a small grill in the yard. Laughter drifted across the porch as the sun began to sink behind the trees. Walter and Cole sat side by side in their usual chairs watching the scene unfold. Walter's voice was softer now when he spoke. You remember the question I asked you? Cole nodded once. At the diner, Walter smiled. "I only asked you to pretend," he said. "Just for one day." Cole stared out toward the road for a long moment before answering. Finally, he reached over and squeezed Walter's shoulder gently. "Guess we're not very good at pretending." Walter chuckled quietly at that. The sound was weak, but genuine. "No," he said. "I suppose you aren't." The riders began calling everyone over for dinner from the yard. The smell of food drifted across the porch. Walter watched them for a moment, then looked back at Cole. "You know what you really gave me?" he asked. Cole shook his head. Walter's eyes moved slowly across the driveway, filled with motorcycles, the men laughing beside the grill, the house that no longer felt empty. "Time," he said. Cole didn't answer right away. The evening air carried the distant rumble of another motorcycle somewhere far down the road. After a while, he stood up and offered Walter a hand to help him to his feet. "Come on," Cole said quietly. "Family's waiting." Walter took the offered hand and rose slowly from the chair. Together, they walked down the porch steps toward the group gathered in the yard. And for the first time in a long time, the old man who had once walked into a diner alone understood something simple and true. Family doesn't always come from where you expect it, but when it shows up, it stays.